welcome everyone to another DesignOps Aligned podcast. I am welcomed by a very special guest by the name of Ben Callahan, who needs no introduction because he is known in this field. He is very, very well known, and I'm going to be diving into his history in a second as we start this podcast. But I would love for him to give an introduction about himself. So yeah, the floor is yours, Ben.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to have a conversation with you and just sort of dive into some of the topics we've been kind of hinting at online. I'm a few things. I'm a father. I'm a partner. I'm a wannabe barista. You can see maybe if you're looking, you can see my machine behind me. I'm also somebody who's just a really curious guy, and I think that has served me well in my career. You know, I've started a few companies. I am currently a founder of a company called Sparkbox, which is I would say we're a digital studio, and a lot of our work is design systems related because that's kind of how we do interface work these days. We do lots of things, but almost all the work we do kind of foundationally ends up in the systems world. And then I also have a sort of an independent consulting and coaching business called Learning Mode. And with that, I do a lot of sort of just like independent research on systems. I do some consulting and a lot of coaching, sort of one-on-one with design system leads. I think that's a part of the industry that's a little bit, organizations don't quite know how to support those folks yet. So I'm trying to figure out how to maybe fill that gap for a season. But yeah, I do a lot of writing and speaking. I'm just curious, I think maybe is the best word.
That's a brilliant portfolio intro that, I've never heard before, because I also done some history on you. You were really like one of the advocates in the beginning about responsive design. You know, I found this out through the grapevine. I never knew about this. And when I heard about it in detail, you were one of the first people to go around the country and show developers about responsive design. I know we've gone a bit off topic with what we're going to speak in the podcast, but I want to delve into that because that's such an interesting subject.
Yeah. I remember when I watched Ethan Marcotte's presentation at an event apart about, responsive web design. At the time, it was sort of the combination of these three very specific techniques, like fluid layouts, images or media that can sort of like adjust its size, and then media queries, of course. And I just remember watching it, and it was like such an interesting time in the industry. Literally, I gave a presentation probably, 6-8 months later at another much smaller event, more local. But I remember this moment where I gave a demo and I changed the width of the browser and the site reflowed to kind of fit. And people literally gasped and started clapping, right? Like, and like these days, you don't even think anything of it. And like, what on earth could you say at a web developer conference to get people to gasp and clap these days, Yeah. I mean, it's just like, it was just a different time. And yeah, I think it was such a freeing expression of what we had been trying to do for so long, like a way to sort of embrace the medium in a more like authentic way, And at the time we had been trying really hard. We were playing with a lot of like liquid layouts and things, just stopping using pixels and fixing widths and using, percentages, and just, we were trying to get there, and Ethan really did such an articulate job of like putting these three ideas together in such a powerful package. And when we saw that, we just were like, oh, that's how we build websites now. I mean, everything we do was that. It was just like not even a question. And so we built one of the first responsive e-commerce sites. Our agency site at the time, we just instantly redesigned, made it responsive. I mean, it was just like everything we did from that point on. We didn't even really talk about it to our clients. We just did it, Yeah. So I think that positioned us well in what we didn't necessarily even really see as like a wave, but it definitely was, and we were fortunate to be there around the beginning. So.
Yeah, I would say it's one of the cornerstones of being a designer nowadays. You need to, if you're not thinking responsive, I don't know what you're doing really, because that's one of your core principles that you should bring if you're purely a UI designer, that should be one of your main principles.
Yeah.
But as a UX designer, that should be part and part, you know. So it was really interesting to hear that you are such a advocate for it. And I'm really honored to have you on the show. It's like you're like a legend. Do you know what I mean? I put you in that legend kind of.
I know what you're doing. Trying to puff up my ego here.
Yeah. It gets us ready for this bit of the podcast. So.
Yeah. Can I say one other thing about responsive? I like right now, a lot of our clients, almost everybody that we talk to is on a big push to get all of their interfaces much more accessible and equitable, you know. And I think at the time that responsive hit the scene, we saw that as a move towards more equitable digital interfaces, because a lot of folks who maybe couldn't afford necessarily to have both a computer, a big, desktop computer and a mobile phone, and pay for internet for the computer and cell service for the phone, they had to choose, and they chose a phone, right? And that means their primary method of interacting with web properties at the time was through a small screen on a much less powerful device at the time, And so for us, I think it was like, we want to make sure everybody can get access to the content of our websites that we're building for these clients. One way to do that is to, of course, make sure they're accessible in like the traditional sense, but also to make sure they fit and can work well on any size screen, and to make sure they're really performant, right? Like in scenarios where I don't have a great cellular connection, how do I make sure there's something that can come down to my device and I can still get the things I need? And so it was never about, for us, it was really not as much about design as it was about access. And I think that is sort of now a fundamental way to solve accessibility problems, is considering reflow and how things, move around on the screen and all that. So I just love that it was sort of born out of such an altruistic and very genuine need to solve this real problem, to get more people access to more content,
Yeah. I've noticed, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong with this, what I have noticed is that a lot of companies who did invest in the responsive aspect of their applications, what they have noticed is that it does bring a lot of, not tech debt, but general technical capacity to build components. Unless if you don't have a design system, and that's what our podcast is going to speak about in a second, generally, if they don't have a core design system and they have a very kind of minimal design system behind it, what I've seen is companies don't like to invest in a responsive component library, and what they're trying to do is move into the adaptive library. What's your take on that? Do you think that's commonly happening now?
That's interesting. I think it may depend on, the complexity of the interface in some ways. It's I don't want to be dismissive, but it's not that much more work to make a content-driven site very responsive, right? That's a problem. Those problems have been solved for, a decade now. And there's lots of writing on that. There's lots of really good examples of that out in the wild. When you get into more complex problems, right now we're working with a client they do some work in the ed tech space, and they have these data tables that are just wildly complex, and so there's so much content crammed into these tables, and the width of them, and what you can see at a certain time, so that you can compare data in certain cells on certain rows. And there's just a lot of nuance to it, and it's not as simple as just, show the first couple cells and hide the rest, or it's not an easy solution, right? So I think when you get into that space, the tendency is to back away from the challenge of thinking, going way back, and asking, should this even be a table, right? You go way back to the root of the problem and say, how do we just help a user accomplish the goal they're trying to solve, instead of coming at it from a let's make tables responsive kind of approach. That requires a lot of work, and then they're hard problems to solve. So I think maybe it's that sort of challenge that folks tend to back away from a little bit. And so I've maybe seen that for sure.
What I have noticed about the adaptive kind of mindset is that you can look at the model or the data model that comes from it and say, hey, I can represent this data in a different way that comes from a mobile experience than it would on a desktop experience. And that's what I've seen where designers are really utilizing that. It's like, okay, this is what, and tables is a really, really good one. Tables is like, okay, that they've got 12 rows or 12 columns of data in its width. Now, what is the most important columns in order to build the same experience? Obviously, you get that kind of level of experience. Like, I want a simplified view, a minimum view, and a very, very detailed view. And what I've seen designers do, it's like, okay, well, in order to still get, how should you say, the MVP experience, or get the same experience as you would on a desktop, what is the minimum type of information you need to see? And that's where I've seen how UX designers have really adopted this adaptive mindset and say, hey, I can readjust the component based on the model, you know? So
yeah,
it's
going to be interesting. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
It is. I think it's very, very interesting, but it puts us in a different mindset to start readjusting or start really focusing on the core experience. And then secondary is like, what's the content to support that experience?
Yeah. Yeah. And part of me wonders, like, I'm just thinking out loud here, should we even be trying to create the same experience, right? Maybe this is not what you're getting at. Like, it's nearly impossible to create the same experience when you take away, 3/4 of the real estate, of the screen real estate. So then it's like, okay, the question is actually less about that. It's more about, what does the user need to accomplish and how do we help them do that in these two different contexts? The problem is, there's way more than two contexts, right? Like, and this is what responsive exposed to us. You go look at your analytics today and you still see this, that screen resolutions, it's just one huge spectrum of numbers. There is no desktop, mobile, tablet crap, that's just a myth. So I hate that, like I don't like the idea in our component work. We try not to say, let's just define these breakpoints and those are the things that we do. It's not about that. It's about, where does the content break and how do we shift the experience when it needs to be shifted? I don't know. There's a lot of nuance in this, and it's so dependent on the context of the app or product or whatever you're working on, so.
I'm going to bring you back on the show for this talk, because we can deep dive into that one.
Love it.
Ben, I brought you onto the show because you run one of the greatest workshops every Friday, which is brilliant. I love it. I will put the link on the show notes here, and you bring on so many talented guests about design systems. And one of the key things I've noticed with design systems in general is that there is a lot of, restrictions that are coming onto designers based on the design system being implemented as part of an organization. I wanted to get your 2 cents. Do you think having such a rigid design system has stopped creativity for UX designers?
My gosh, dude, you are like diving right in.
I go straight in. I just go straight in.
Right for the jugular. Okay. So there's like the classic answer to this, right, from systems people is, that's ridiculous. Don't be immature, you designer. Like, where, you shouldn't have complete creative freedom because you're working within the confines of your organization and the business goals of that organization. And I think that, so like those folks will say to you, and I don't disagree with this, like, focus on solving bigger problems, right? Use the common solutions. Like, here's the color palette to use, like pull from these instead of choosing something in between these, right? Or choose these typefaces at these sizes, or whatever these really common sort of fundamental building blocks are. But those same people are also working often on systems that provide much more composed and more opinionated pieces and parts, right? Like, they're not only offering foundations, they're offering components, and they're offering sometimes very complex components that are very opinionated about their look and feel. So, I understand the designers feeling that pressure. There's a weird balance here. And this sort of a little analogy came about through some digging I've done into more classic systems thinking, like not related to digital work at all, just like general systems theory. There's this old professor, Russell Ackoff is his name. And he tells this amazing story where he's talking about like the sort of need. Well, I'll try to tell you the story quickly. So he does the example of saying, like, let's think about cars. So if we go out and we do this research and we try to figure out which vehicle in the world has the absolute best engine, and we look at every car, right? And we decide maybe it's the Rolls-Royce has the best engine. So we take that engine out of the car and we put it right here in the room with us. Then we do the same thing on braking systems, exhaust, ignition, all of the systems, all the little pieces and parts that are needed to make the best cars in the world. And we take the absolute best thing from each of those and we bring it into the room. Now, what do we have in the room, right? We have every single piece and part that you would need to make a car, but we actually can't even go around the corner and get groceries with it because these pieces and parts are incredibly high quality. They haven't been designed to work together. And systems work is about the space between the parts, right? It's about making things that are high quality, but they have to also interface with each other. And I think this is the tension between a system designer and a product designer. A product designer is the person who's like, I'm going to make the best engine in the world. A system designer is the person who's thinking more about how does the engine connect to the ignition, connect to or interface with braking, interface with suspension, right? And the truth is we need the tension between those, and a systems person should fight for, this is going to sound weird, don't hate. It's a systems person is going to prioritize the quality of the system, and that means there's a compromise in the quality of the part. And a product designer is going to prioritize the quality of the part, which means there's a compromise in the quality of the system. And the only way we're able to solve this is by putting these folks together and letting them kind of work through those priorities. And it requires compromise on both sides,
Yes.
And so that is a little bit of us saying, yeah, you're going to have to give up some autonomy because you're working within a larger system, right?
This is where I'm always kind of like coming to, okay, let me put this in a better way. Let me actually rephrase this. What I notice that designers tend to do, or what a design system manager tries to do, is that he tries to build components foreseeing that it can be used in many, many cases. And what I have seen is that you cannot think about every single use case. And that's where I see the tension happening, because they're trying to say, hey, look, it's like insurance. It's like, you need insurance for this. You need insurance for that. But really and truly, the person's like, do I really need this insurance? You haven't even asked me if I actually really need it. And that's where I see the tension. It's like the design system manager or the person who's managing these design systems is not speaking to the community and say, well, what are the different use cases for your component? And then building a plan to make sure they cater as to much uses as possible, to then satisfy a designer's needs. And I think this is what I find, and I think fonts is a really, really good one. Fonts is a really good one where they kind of, a design system manager will kind of say, here's the fonts you could use. 9 out of 10 times, they're always detached, because a designer's like, I need a pixel, like, a font size of 23 pixels, and you've given me only like 20 and 24, and I can't work with this. And it's the common battle that I see design managers having. Now, what would you say to people that's listening to the podcast? How can they get past that?
I mean, if you, so this is the sort of clarity between the responsibilities of these roles. So if you're a product designer and your system only gives you things at 20 and 28 pixels and you need 24, right? So what I would say is detach it and do it, and then show me the data that that's a better solution for the whole. And if it is, then that's something that others would also benefit from doing product work, and we can figure out how to integrate that, right? This is like, there's like stuff on the fringes of systems work that, that's where the product designers, their job is to innovate and to go solve these problems in new, different ways. And a system that has the posture of saying, no, you can't do that, is not going to be a system that succeeds, So I think we have to come to the table with this mind of like, I want to enable you with really smart defaults that create good cohesion and give us a lot of efficiency. But your job also is to kind of push on the boundaries a little bit and like help us extend in really smart ways. So, I don't know, there's definitely a trend too, I would see in the space for systems to start constricting their scope instead of like expanding, right? Yeah. And I think that's a really smart move. We go, this is probably a pendulum that swings. I don't know if we've been doing it long enough to see a few swings back and forth yet or not, but when we started, we kept things pretty tight. It was like, okay, let's get foundational, right? What is the overlap in all of our products? And that's, the more products you have, that's a smaller and smaller bit, So that is a clear definition of the responsibility for the system. But then we started seeing the benefits and we were like, oh, we could do more. We could expand. We could offer more components. We could compose things into much larger experiences. We can give you templates. Like there's all these other things we can do. And all of a sudden now that the maintenance of that and the frustration around the sort of creativity and all of that is kind of exposing that, wow, that's a lot, And so I think we're in that phase of kind of constricting a bit and saying, okay, let's be really smart about this. Here's the problem with that. So I'm just going to get on my soapbox for a minute here.
No, go for it.
I think what we were trying to do was create more impact out further into product, right? And that I don't think is a bad thing. Like helping product teams to make more impact is great. That's what we should be doing. I just don't think the way to do that is through really tangible assets. So I've been thinking a lot about this. Like, it's not enough to just build stuff, like things that I can, like a Figma libraries or React components or whatever that I can pull directly into my work. That gets me a part of the way. That's like the baseline of entry for making impact with a system. But for teams like, product designers that are out doing things that are never actually going to be done in other products, how does the system team have an impact there? I think the way they do that is through culture, right? We have to be a team that creates a culture where we as product designers and developers value the same things that the system is trying to solve. If organizationally, if we all care about cohesion, if we want to create products that are cohesive, that feel like a family, then individuals doing work that isn't necessarily part of the scope of a system, like in terms of overlap of product, they're going to make good decisions about what they do, and they're going to intentionally, create that cohesion. So that's where I'm like, that's, I think, where the most impact is, because that's organization wide. If I can find ways to adjust the decision-making frameworks that person is using to decide what font, what size font, or the incentive structures that their boss is using to sort of like value their work, like if we can get to that stuff, then all of a sudden we start shifting what people care about, and now we can get alignment. And then it's like, you've got assets for things that are common, you've got culture for things that are not, and you can just like tear through work and make really cohesive stuff very efficiently, So that, I think, is like the ideal.
Let me pull his name out. Nathan Curtis. Yeah. He made a very, very good article just recently, actually, where he talked about moving to the federal. Well, his approach a few years back was to move to the federated system. And a lot of people in that design system space were like, hey, federated system, you get that culture of people contributing back, building that community spirit. But what he's now realized after so many years and after the article, he has now said that the centralized system is the way to go. Now, I want to get your 2 cents on that. But before you mention that, we met last week. We met to have a prep call about this podcast. And you used such a great metaphor about the word policing. And I love that. And I wanted to bring this up on the podcast, and I want to hope that you can bring that statement back in. But it's about these design system managers policing designers on components, well, just general on their designs, to even contribute back or generate on their day-to-day activity. And now we'd love the audience to hear your statement on that one.
Yeah, and I have to give credit where credit is due on this. I helped organize an event in Pittsburgh called Symmetry earlier this year. And one of my good friends, Dan Denny, was there. He came up from Tennessee and attended. And we were having, this was not a normal design system event. It was a little bit more like we had some industry leaders there to present some challenges to us. And then as a community, we sat down and kind of broke up and tried to like think through, how do we address these problems? You know, how do we address these challenges? And one of the things that kept coming up was what you've asked about so far, you know, this idea of like that sort of tension around creativity and feeling restricted. And at one of those small group discussions, Dan brought this idea up. Dan Denny mentioned this. He said, this reminds me of the policing scenario that we have. And I think he and I are both in the States, so I don't know in Europe like what the situation is around this, but I think most folks are probably aware that there's a lot of challenges with policing here in the States right now. And, you know, a lot of folks are feeling that tension and have experienced that very directly. And I think his analogy, and the one that I'm trying to sort of like express here, is we can't be that sort of like forceful kind of design system that's like going in guns blazing, for lack of a better term, and saying, you can't do that, right? No, no, no. If that's our approach, that's not a healthy approach. And I think instead what we're looking for, and the analogy over in the policing space would be be a part of the community, like get to know the people, right? Like build trust with them. And then when they need help, they know they can call you and they can trust you to come and like actually help them in a scenario, you know? But if you don't have that trust, you can't be somebody who says no, you know, like there may be a scenario where no is the right thing to say, but before you do that, you got to have the relationship. So I think that is like maybe a little bit of the analogy that I think is actually really powerful. And it comes back to the core, which I think you hinted at this in the original question, which is these system teams aren't necessarily talking to product teams. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that right there, like those are your users. Go talk to your users, you know? Like, I mean, that's like such a simple, basic tenet of product work, you know? Got to know your user. And I think sometimes it's easy to skip over that.
I bet I'm lost for words with that statement. I've been running it through my head ever since you told me it. And it's such a perfect example on how design system managers can really enhance their work. Be part of your community, speak to them. And this is what I noticed. I think this is what I've noticed in my career, is that those design managers they're not thinking about the designers. They're thinking more like, my end product is the components, the code that comes with those components. But it's like, no, really and truly, the main people are the users and it's the designers. The components are secondary. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. That's really well said. You know, I think it's easy to, we're in this time where it's like all these big companies that they have, you know, dozens and dozens of people on their design system teams. They're making these incredible design languages and design systems that are so powerful and really beautiful. And they make these doc sites that look like, I mean, they're just enticing. It's like, oh my gosh, I want to do that too. Right. And, at that same event in Symmetry, Jeremy Keith was there and he drew this connection. He said, public facing doc sites are kind of like social media, where it's like you only put your best self out on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. You don't put the fact that you woke up with the messy hair, you know? And, I think it's so true, you know, and it creates the same problem, right? Where we're looking at these things and we're thinking we're not doing a good job because we're not doing it like Carbon, or we're not doing it like whatever, name your system, you know? And the truth is, systems, they have to grow within the context of your org. I've probably worked on, at Sparkbox, we've done dozens and dozens of these things at many different scales. Every one of them is different, you know, and it's because we're trying to like actually understand the context within which they have to take root and grow. And so it's not okay for us to just say, oh, Spotify did it this way, so I'm going to do it that way. That doesn't work, right? Now, there's probably lessons in those articles, and you can look to those things for some guidance, but it always has to be filtered through your context and your culture.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head with that one, because I think one of the key things I've always seen is, and this is like, we're talking like 8 years ago when material design and Bootstrap was there. Everyone thought that these ready-made design libraries were gonna sort out all of their tech debt. But I think we've come to that moment of realization that it brought more tech debt down the line if you had not invested in a design system in the beginning. Now, I want to get your take on this because I know you do a lot of research into design systems behind the scenes. And I've spoken to a lot of people since doing the podcast. One of the key things I've always found that they keep telling me is that they don't have enough resources on the design system. It's kind of like, it's like the father, he's at the bottom of the pecking chain. Do you know what I mean? It's like, the children come first, and even the cat comes first before the father. So it's like that on the design system team. And, they're really struggling how to show businesses the benefit of a design system. Now, what's your take on it?
I think I definitely have, worked with a lot of folks who feel this tension for sure. And partly I think it's why there's maybe that trend we talked about a moment ago of constricting the responsibility of the system. When we're in that phase, and I think Elise Holiday talks a little bit about this in her presentation from Clarity earlier this year, where she talked about how even just like looking at the larger economic climate when systems were kind of really coming onto the scene, it was sort of like it was a good time financially, at least here in the States it was. And so I think organizations had cash to throw around, and there was somebody in the org saying, we can be faster, we can keep the quality high, we can reuse things, we can bake accessibility in. If you give me a budget for the next year to hire up a team of design system folks, that'll benefit us for a long time. And those things are all true, but it is expensive. And you put a team of, 6 people on something for a year, you're spending a lot of money, right? And then as things got tight, when you look around, these organizations look around, we see all these layoffs. Where do you think they're going to go, right? They're looking at, this product is making us this much profit. This team, this design systems team, there's no direct correlation to profit. And so because there's not a connection to the money, when things get tight, the systems team goes, And sometimes those folks are fortunate, they can get reorganized onto other product teams if they have that skill set, but more often than not, they're let go. And so the size of those teams definitely is somewhat dependent on the larger economic things happening. A lot of folks are trying to solve the problem you described, which is like, how do I prove the value of this? And there's lots of different ways to do that. Most folks are doing a form of math, where they look at how many components do we have? How often are those used in products? How much time would it take me to build that from scratch versus using this and kind of customizing it or creating a new theme or whatever? And you can kind of, back your way into some numbers that are actually quite large, when you're just talking about time saved. I actually think it's really hard to make this connection in a very meaningful way. And it's hard for a lot of reasons, but I actually think the real efficiency benefit in systems work is much less about having reusable components. I actually think it's much more about having a common language for people solving problems to speak. Because I've been in so many meetings, you've probably been in these, where you go in, you think, okay, we're going to solve this problem, describe it, we understand our approach, let's go do our work, and we'll come back next week and compare notes. You come back and you realize you've missed each other, like you just misunderstood each other, and you spent a week going in different directions.
Yeah.
If that's, talk about inefficiency, like you put a team of 3 or 4 people go in the wrong direction for a week, and now you're reworking stuff. There's not only that, but there's all this frustration because we didn't hear each other. If a system can help give us language so that we actually know what we're talking about in those meetings, it's just such a huge efficiency gain. But that's really hard to measure,
Enjoying the content? Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn, TikTok, and Instagram for more updates. Your support helps us bring you even more great content. Now let's get back to our podcast.
Wow. That is amazing. Absolutely. I have never heard, and I'm not just saying that just because you're on my podcast show. That is such an amazing statement. Like, and you're absolutely right. It's that language, it's the language that we speak with each other. Like, you call this a dialogue, he calls it a modal, and that is, I would say, 9 out of 10 problems of speaking the right language. And that's just on the component level. You're talking on the business level. The language is where the issues are. It's that communication. And I've never seen that. You've just highlighted my eyes to something I have been completely oblivious to.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's so important. And that's the cultural side of this too, is the interactions between the people, and that's where I feel like that's the real impact. And it's so hard. It's murky. It's not real clear. It's the gray space between everything. And also it's like hard for, individual contributors in Figma making tokens or variables. It's like, how's that person, when you say, well, that's your job, but also you have to change the culture of the company. Like, I mean, come on, so this is where I think instead of having more and more individual contributor, designer, developer folks on these teams, we definitely need those folks. Like, I'm not saying we don't, but we also need more senior, like more strategic executive voice in that too. And that's hard, that's hard to find. It's hard to fund. So, yeah.
I mean, if I was a design manager and I'm listening to this podcast, my first attention would be to use, as you just mentioned, time. Time is such a business language measurement to speak, and to speak that kind of a terminology to show, return of investment. And I have never really thought that, a design system, and I believe what you've just said, they would be the main contributors of changing the communication language, the internal communication language. And I'm really glad you brought that to my attention. That's such an eye-opener because I've never seen it. And I think you can really show it as a secondary impact from a design system because, again, time is what you speak with the business, but generally not focusing on detachment of components, not focusing on how many components are being reused and how many components have been made. If you focus on the language and the communication, that brings so much more efficiency than I have a library of 200 components. So wow, amazing.
Yeah, it's a good one, but it is really tough to measure, and because there's so many things that impact the team's velocity. There's how much work they can get done, all of that. It's hard to connect that impact directly to a change in the language offered by the system,
no, absolutely. Yeah. But it's that educational purpose. And then, it's that, I think when anything comes with new, it's that team process and, checking in, because that's part of DesignOps. I'm going to do some product placement now.
All right, do it.
No, but I think this is part of our challenge in DesignOps Aligned when we go into companies and we're trying to change something, especially when we don't think about the language. It's more, we talk about the communication that designers should have with product managers and people above. Like, don't speak about UX. That's what we try and tell them. Speak about the business value and the impact, turn it around from saying, hey, we made this UI look beautiful because it's outdated to, by making this UI brilliant, it matches our competitors and we will see. Can you see? It's like a completely different mind shift if you talk about business impact rather than, hey, it just looks good for our users. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
I think that's smart.
Yeah. I think it's it's the language that we should all be speaking as designers because, product managers think about one thing and us designers, and I'm sorry to say, and I'll probably get hate from saying this, us UX designers only think about the user. We're just so user focused. And if you take that business perspective as well, it will kind of make you think like, hey, I'm going to do this design, but what value is it going to bring? What impact is it going to bring? Like, how am I going to measure it to show that we are doing X, Y, Z? And this is what we do at DesignOps Aligned. So that's it. That's the end of my product placement for now. So, You've lost me a thought because I love that statement that you made. Ben, I want to get your 2 cents on this in the sense of, so Ben, it can't be a podcast without speaking about a bit of AI. It's really hot on the topic at the moment. And you must have heard about Figma releasing their AI tool. Obviously, they've given just a taste sample of like, I think 3 design libraries that you can mess around with, but you can build a wireframe with a prompt and literally grab the components from your design library into that wireframe. Now, I wanted to get your take on how AI is going to affect the industry with AI automation. And now it's looking to take over, well, not take over, it's looking to get its hands inside of the design system space.
Yeah. I mean, how powerful, to have that ability, especially if, you're feeding it with your own sort of, guidelines and rules and tokens and all of those things. I think I'm more interested in what I see happening in the system space around. I don't really know what the word. I'm sure somebody has a good word for this. I need to figure that out. But like more like functional systems where I don't. So like an easy example would be if we just think about how we put color into our interface. Like the standard before systems was the designer gives me a Photoshop file or something, right, or a Figma file, and I go copy the hex code and I put it in my thing. Well, now, of course, we have variables, we have tokens, so we can sort of like create these layers of abstraction. And now I can use essentially a variable in my code that refers to something that can be changed in another place. And so we get lots of benefits from that. The next evolution of that, I think, is the ability for me to say, not just give me the color for the primary brand background or whatever, but give me the right color in this context, and let an algorithm, it is probably not necessarily AI, but let an algorithm figure out what the right color is, and so it's a function instead of a variable, right? Like and it can evolve and it can change, and depending on the context of the interface, it can shift things, so you could make it so that it says, oh, you're doing a text color. Let me look at the background color and make sure the contrast ratio is good for you here, right? There's all kinds of things you could do with that. And color is like the tip of the iceberg, So I think that sort of like more functional approach to systems, I think, is where things are probably going to go. That requires, a lot more, like the rules have to be clearly defined so they can be sort of used in the algorithm, right? Like, that means there's no more fuzziness for you around like defining what it means to, like, when would I use one thing over another? We need to be clear about that. So I think it pushes us to be more articulate in areas where I think that's really valuable for humans and for algorithms. But I don't know. I mean, in terms of AI, we'll see. Like I studied computer science in school, and my emphasis was on AI. And this was like a long time ago. And so it's been really fun for me to see this sort of like sweep across the last few years. I'm paying attention and playing with a lot of tools, but I feel like there's so much up in the air still.
Yeah, definitely. But, I think, and this is my 2 cents, I think Figma have now come to the realization that design systems should be integrated into the design tool. Obviously we have dev tools with handovers. Great, brilliant. But what I've been also looking into is other companies who are utilizing, Zeppelin were really good in that kind of initial space of handovers. But what I'm seeing now is a lot of companies are investing that the tool and the design system repo and the design tool are coming into one. And I'll give you an example of a company I started looking into. It's called UXPin. Probably heard of them, they're probably just low in the market, but what they're really starting to utilize is the fact of the design system being really integrated in the design tool to help with, variations of the components, to give you UI testing directly, to actually see, the design in code without having to pass it to the developer. I think this is where we're moving to, what's your take on that?
It's interesting, you know, like part of me gets excited about that kind of thing. Part of me gets really nervous about it. Like,
Okay.
if we think about, like if you said Figma as an example, that's what tool most of the folks who are listening are probably familiar with. So let's talk about Figma. You know, started as a design collaboration tool, right? Like the thing that blew me away with Figma when I first saw it was we could all be in the file editing it together, right? I remember that was just like mind blowing for me. But very quickly, the feature set has shifted towards, you know, component-driven design, more systematic approach, the breaking down, the refactoring of larger things into smaller bits that we can reuse, which is incredibly valuable. And it is systems work. But you would be surprised. Well, maybe you wouldn't be. I've talked to so many of my clients and coaching coachees and just other folks in the space who, at their organization, they see the Figma files as the design system. And I think that's risky, right? Like all of a sudden, our entire foundation for how we build interface lives inside someone else's tool. So I have a bit of it, maybe like a controversial take on this. I don't know. I think of design systems. I think a system has to exist absent every tool. I think the work of for us is to say, like, what are the pieces and parts? Let's define those well. Let's create the language of those. And then we see Figma as like an instantiation of that. It's an instance of a button, right? But the button has to be defined conceptually first. And then it needs to be created in parity from design tools like Figma, maybe backwards to like Axure or other wireframing tools, maybe forwards to React or Angular or Vue or whatever, you know. So those are all just instances of a thing that has to be sort of conceptual for us. That is where the truth is. This is like a weird, you know, way to think about it. But the truth is those tools are going to come and go. The frameworks are going to come and go. And so we can't have our core interface in one tool, you know, like that's just not how it works. So I feel like that's a bit of a risky place to go. And so I don't know. That's my take, I guess.
That's a brilliant take. And I love that you brought the fact that Figma was, you know, their main focus was about collaboration. And that's what sold it to me to move on to there. You know, I remember Sketch, their main focus was symbols and assets, reusable things. Moving from, you know, Photoshop to Figma, to Sketch, you're like, oh, wow, I don't have to repeat this again and again and again. I don't have to copy layers. I just copy one thing and then I get that moving quicker in my designs. And yeah, it'll be interesting where we go with the next step. As mentioned, I think, you know, my personal take is I think Figma are looking deep into the design system integration, but I could be wrong.
No,
you know?
And like, you know, all the different, like making it available now for engineers to be a little bit more participatory in Figma, like things like that, I can see as definitely leaning in that direction, you know?
Yeah.
So time will tell.
Ben, we're coming up to the last bits of the show. I want to get your take on this. Now, it's one of my key things that I'm trying to ascertain as you know, as I'm working with so many designers. Do you think, and you've got this show on Friday about this, which is something that's deep to my heart because I come from that background. I come from a hybrid background. I'm initially a developer by trade. But I went into design. Now I want to get your take on this. Do you think designers should have that development knowledge in order to be in this field? And I'll take you back. I left it to the last minute. I've done that on purpose.
That's so funny.
I'll give like 2 cents.
Yeah.
I came from a development background. Or I went into development more just because it was that language barrier. And you could speak the development language and you could really understand what it takes in order to get your designs into code. And that's why I went down that route. Now, what's your take on it? Should designers have development knowledge?
I mean, honestly, this is less a question of skills and more a question of empathy in my mind. And I actually think it serves any person doing any job. You're going to be better at your job if you understand the different roles that you have to interface with and what they experience, right? So as a designer, it's going to make you a better designer to understand the implications of the decisions you make in design on engineering. But also as an engineer, it's going to make you a better engineer to understand the implications of the design you make in code back to design, decisions you make in code, back to design. Like, this is not about designers should code. That's like such a microscopic view of a much larger issue, which is the problem of silos, And I just think we should all be trying to understand how our decisions ripple through the work. And that's it, And the more you do that, the more empathy you have for those folks. And just, it just gives you the ability to like trust, them to make decisions that sort of like take that into account. I don't know. That's, to me, I think that's sort of how I've always thought about this conversation,
why and I'll tell you how I done it. So I bought a subscription on Webflow and I gave it to this design team. And the reason why I gave it to this specific design team was they were bringing up a lot of bugs, and I'm talking just for one pixel here, one pixel there. Now I get that. I totally get UI debt. UI debt is common. And, if you ask, and this is pretty funny, when I asked the designer, do you know what tech debt is? They're like, oh, it's the cost on how much it is to develop the feature. I'm like, no, it's the stuff that they push to the side that they say is a debt to them because they have to come back and fix it. So it started to get them to start thinking around, oh, okay, I never knew that terminology, but also understand some basic terminology or understanding of CSS or understanding. And I gave it to them. I gave a Webflow subscription to them. And I noticed when I had given that to them, it brought them down to the level that a developer's work is not as easy as you think. And you go through this. And I put them and said, you go through the same issue every day. A product manager thinks they can do your work and you think you could do a developer's work. It really brought them back to that kind of ground level. So that was my 2 cents in there.
I love that. I mean, what I hear you saying is like, actually, we kind of need each other to do this, right? Like, And so, like the thing you design, the picture of the interface is not the product, right? The thing you develop is the product. But if you don't have the skill to make it look and feel in a way that allows users to accomplish things, then you can't do that on your own, And so we need each other. And that's just the crux of it. And this is, I think, why I have found myself so enthralled with design systems, because it is the marrying of all of this, The interface is where the design and the code come together. And it's really just, I think for me, it's just like a place I think there's so much room for this space to create incredible impact in an organization. And so I'm on a mission to try and figure out how to do that better, So,
I know we're running out of time, but I want to get your answer on this. Like, what do you say to design system people who try to make a design system that fits loads of products? And't give you my example. I'm coming across a team where they're trying to embed their design system on multiple. We're not talking 5 or 6, we're talking like 20 different products. What would you advise to somebody who's going through that? And would you even advise them to go through that work?
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to my mind right away. One, I've heard Dan Mall say this. I 100% agree with this idea, which is that the strength of what he has said is like, the more products you're trying to serve, the smaller your design system should be, right? And I think that's true because you're looking at commonalities, right? So if I have just 2 products, the Venn diagram is going to be maybe 50-50, right? But if I add a third into there, all of a sudden it drops to a little bit. And then you add 20 products, the amount of overlap between 20 products is pretty small. Mm-hmm. So that's, in my mind, what that would initially, where I would go without knowing a lot of the detail here is, let's really understand very fundamental layers, like some guidelines and principles? What are our values? What are we trying, and that's like getting more towards culture work, and then how do we make some of that, accessible to folks, like some color palettes and some type and some just really basic common stuff. There's this concept in design systems that I've heard Davey talk about he has the Design System podcast. They talk about, or Office Hours, one of those, I can't remember, sorry. But they talk about micro adoption, and it's like, you don't have to only use components. You can use the system at these different tiers, And so I think that's a powerful way in that context. The other thing is, of course, like the culture side of this. And that's where I always would go. And it's like, you're dealing as a systems team, you have to interact with 20 different teams. Every one of those teams is going to have its own subculture. And that means for you, you've got to figure out how do I work with these subcultures differently, And there's a lot of work to do there to understand. And that pushes you down the path of thinking about your process in a less binary way and in more as like a spectrum of ways to work together, And so I think that's probably, I would push in on like the spectrum of the processes and like focusing on those fundamental layers,
Man, I could speak to you for hours. Literally, I can
likewise, man.
Speak to you for hours. And just so you know, it was actually the first workshop for the question where I saw Davey, and after going to that show, that's when I brought him onto the podcast. So he already recorded his show few weeks ago, but it was literally that your workshop that I went to, and I was, like you said, I was blown away. Like the micro adoption mindset, it's absolutely amazing. So
yeah, it's cool. Yeah, so much power in that. And, it creates a different set of challenges, I think, for an organization to work through. But it also is a pretty quick way to create some impact at lower levels, in product. So that's cool.
Absolutely. Ben, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Like I said, we could speak for hours and we could just keep on going. And it's such an honor to have you on here. When I knew about your history, I was like, wow. I was so honored to really bring you onto the show and that you were willing to come onto it. So it means a lot to the DesignOps team.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for thinking of me and for the invitation and for having such a spicy conversation. Like you're not willing to, you haven't been hesitant to dive into topics that have been maybe more controversial in the industry. So I love that. Thanks for prompting a good combo.
We're definitely going to have you back. We're definitely going to have you back. And yeah.